We put up the bat beam with the urgency as a result of the SCOTUS rulings today. The former federal prosecutor, now defense attorney in Southern California, one of the great legal analysts in the English-speaking world, has agreed to give us sort of a turbo version of the segment that we regularly do on Thursdays. How about it for David Katz? Thank you, David.
Hi, great to be with you. Hi, Kim.
We more or less explained this in the first hour, and I want to see if the explanation in any way conforms with your understanding of the SCOTUS decision on the enjoining of executive order. Basically, in 30 seconds or less, I made the point that this isn't a decision on the actual executive order involving birthright citizenship. It's a decision on the injunction of that executive order and the ability of district judges and judges across the country to enjoin, to stop the executive orders across the country. Now, the Supreme Court is saying those district judges can enjoin the executive orders in their district, in their territory, but they don't have any power to enjoin, to stop the decisions from the executive beyond that. Is that essentially it?
Yes, I've been predicting that the ruling on the merits of birthright citizenship would be 9-0 or maybe 7-2. But at the oral argument, it became clear that the Supreme Court didn't want to take that on head on. I don't know why. They wanted to sidestep it. And this is the sidestep that it looked like that they might actually try, even though it's such an important case, Mark. I have to say, I think it's somewhat political that since it's Trump's big, huge issue, it's one of his big rally issues, that they just figured there was another way kind of to not rule on this, and they found it. And I think that that's really despicable. I think the Supreme Court should say it's absolutely clear in the Constitution. The issue was before them. There's no argument for why when the Supreme Court sees a provision of the Constitution, Mark, which says if you're born in the United States, you become a citizen of the United States, that they shouldn't just rule that. And that would, of course, eliminate all of this, what I consider sidestepping and games playing. So
yes,
the
but
good news,
David, isn't it in a way more dangerous? Because now you
Sure.
could have two Americas. You could have the America where certain liberties are enjoyed in red states that don't exist in blue, or that exist in blue that don't exist in red.
That could happen with a lot of things, and wait until the shoe is on the other foot. Wait until a Democratic administration goes through, and case by case, you can't assert your Second Amendment rights. Case by case, you have to hire a lawyer and go to your local court and have the local court say Second Amendment or no Second Amendment. I don't have power to do anything except in your case. Oh, Joey's case down the road that looks an awful lot like yours. No, I have no power to reach Joey's case. And Joey didn't enter a class action with you. And maybe 5 of you did enter a class action. Well, all the other people who aren't in the class action, I can't give them any relief. This one is going to really either come around, and the people who think this is great news are going to absolutely rue the day that the Constitution isn't being enforced nationwide on a consistent basis. When it does come around and we have, I think, more level-headed, more unbiased U.S. Supreme Court justices, they will reverse this precedent. But what's important, Mark, is that there has been a couple of things important. Number one, there's been no ruling on birthright citizenship. Everyone who just reads this headline or sees Trump saying, I won a great victory, this does not mean that if your child is born in the United States, they're not a citizen. It doesn't mean that at all. If parents don't have legal status, that doesn't mean that their child doesn't have citizenship in this country. That will be the ultimate ruling. That's going to be the world will work. Your kids will be citizens. Will you have some odd things happen to you along the way? Yes. Because now, as you say, Mark, there's two parts of the country. There's countries where the states have said, this is ridiculous, and we're not going to try to enforce this in our states. We're not going to be running around and having problems with birth certificates and so forth. So in California and in New York, everybody born in this state, also being part of the United States, is a citizen. They register them as a citizen. In the other states where the states are not fighting, the records may get screwed up. Now, ultimately, there'll be a record of where your child is born, right? And when your child is born, and they will become a birthright citizen. And if anyone ever tries to mess around with them or something otherwise, yes, they'll have a bureaucratic headache. They may have to go to an agency, go to a court and show, hey, I was born, and it could be the worst state in the country. I was born in Iowa that hates birthright citizenship, but I was born on such and such a date in Iowa, and they will have birthright citizenship because that is the substantive law of the United States. That will be the substantive law of the United States. But yes, they'll have hassles in those 28 states. And the reality of what's going to happen to some of the people is that you may have to hire a lawyer in a blue state or in a red state, because if something really does happen, like, I don't know, because of your child is actually cut off of something that only citizen babies have and that non-citizen babies don't have, some kind of health program, and you're told you don't qualify because you're in some red state and you haven't won a ruling yourself, you would hire a lawyer or you would go to a public interest group and you would file in court and you would say, my child is entitled to this citizen baby benefit because my child is a citizen baby, and you'd have the proof of when your baby was born, and anywhere in the United States, they would be a citizen. Now, you talked about the ramifications for other cases, and that's true. So if some state decides that, they don't really like Muslims in that state, so Muslims are not going to be allowed to worship, or Muslims are not going to be allowed to demonstrate more than 5 of them at a time, because these terrible things seem to happen in the Middle East when a lot of people congregate, and there seem to be Muslims over there. That kind of know-nothingism. Some judge would say right now, well, no, throughout the entire state, you can't ban Muslims from congregating. That violates their First Amendment rights. In that kind of a case, you would think there would be a class action, because there would be some Muslim activist group that would have lawyers that would get all those people together. They would file a lawsuit, and then they would be covered by the ruling of the judge. The ruling of the judge would be the 1,000 class members who are before the court. They would all get relief. Even in that situation, the people who are not members of the class, although they would say, hey, wait a second, we're not Iowa Muslims, we're Nebraska Muslims. We want the exact same benefit of that ruling. That would have been a nationwide injunction that would have given it throughout the country. Now, at best, under this ruling, it would be the Iowa-wide injunction at best. It might only be the injunction as to the people who are in the class of Muslims who appeared before the court in Iowa. And so, yes, there'd have to be all these copycat lawsuits. All the Republicans who love to say how the federal courts are clogged, they've just clogged the federal courts, beyond belief, because they made all this litigation happen. And as I say, all of it could have been decided on birthright citizenship just by saying the Constitution's clear. There is birthright citizenship, but the Republicans, the ones appointed by Trump, the famous 6 out of the 9 on the U.S. Supreme Court, wanted to bystep this and make a bunch of terrible law. And the very last thing is they went back to the Judiciary Act. This is always how they misuse history. They go back to the Judiciary Act, 1780s. They try to figure out what power did the chancellor have in England? How did that get carried over to the United States? And it's just so irrelevant. We have a tradition in this country for decades. This isn't new, these nationwide injunctions. When the Republicans controlled some of these seats, when Biden was in power, remember we had nationwide injunctions? We had a nationwide injunction on mephistoprone and all that kind of stuff. And our system was just fine, because if there was a nationwide injunction that was really out of step, you could always go to the appellate court. Well, first, you could ask the judge to stay the nationwide injunction. I think even in mephistoprone, while the judge was going to impose a nationwide injunction that would have stopped women in blue states from getting the medication of preference to stop an abortion, to have an abortion, to stop a pregnancy. Even that judge, who was cherry-picked in some very right-wing district, I believe, stayed his injunction. So the first relief under the old rules was that while it might be a nationwide injunction, it got stayed. If the district judge wouldn't stay it, then you would run to the Court of Appeals and you would get them to stay it. And if the Court of Appeals wouldn't stay it, you would run to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there was a remedy. The idea that the country was going wild with these things, the ones I remember were mephistoprone. I remember one on student loans that I think got dissolved. And I remember one on the Muslim ban, Trump, first time around. And the Muslim ban was ultimately, I believe, upheld in the courts, that there could not be a Muslim ban, that you could not ban people just because they were from a Muslim majority country. Yes, that was issued in the Bay Area. Yes, you can say it was shopped around to the Bay Area. And guess what? The decision that was made on it stood the test of time and was right. that nationwide injunction. So this is the conservatives and the people who want to help Trump, are looking for a workaround, a way out, and it's kind of weaselly.
Vilma is saying, how do you know that Trump will mark everyone who opposes Trump or his policies an enemy of the state, opponent in elections, enemies of the state? This is a provocative, and it speaks to a dissent, like how Trump may view dissent in some way, like the assembly associated with a protest against the government, whatever, as dissent that is seditious, that is, I mean, you know how they gin it up. They could gin up whatever verbiage they wanted. Can you speak to that? Because nothing seems like a bridge too far anymore.
Well, I'm not worried about being a dissenter on media that's disseminated. I don't think that David K. Johnston is. I don't think you are, Mark. I don't think that loads and loads of people are. One thing is that it does occur even to the right wingers and the Republicans that they will be dissenters one day on many issues. And we're just not going to have a police state where you say something and the next thing they come into your podcast or they come into your TV station and they drag you out in a true.
No, but they could sue you. I'm not saying that they arrest you right away, but they could. This is the way that they sue you, or the government comes down on you in some way. Maybe that's sort of already happening. We've seen it happen at ABC and CBS, et cetera. So perhaps that that is your point. Is what we're seeing happening is sort of where it's going to stop in terms of choking off dissent.
Well, under Nixon, there were targeted IRS audits of
Sure.
enemies. There's supposed to be safeguards for that. You look at some of the people that have been put into high office. Do I trust them to obey the rule of law? Do I trust them to observe the traditional safeguards? So overpay your taxes. But really, I mean, everyone should speak out. That's the kind of thing, especially at this stage in this country. We're not, a Stalinist Russia. We're not even like Hungary. And it's part of the way that Trump tries to control is not really through the law, but through intimidation, through bullying, through his ballyhoo. And we've stood up since he was inaugurated this second time. People of goodwill have stood up. And we've changed so many things. 95% of the court decisions have been won against Trump. You look at even this one. He talks about birthright citizenship everywhere. And yes, he's made it harder, but people have looked at it and said, of course, birthright citizenship is here to stay. You don't see people, I don't think, not coming here or changing their behavior on something like this that really matters, Mark, so that their child can be not born or born here. I mean, life kind of goes on. Yes, there are some definite hiccups, especially out here. We talked about it last night on your great show, June Swoon, about the ICE thing. And the ICE raids are really getting to people. They're realizing it's terrible for humanity. It's terrible for their neighbors. It's terrible for the economy. And there's a huge reaction against that. We had those demonstrations. There were over 5 million people. That's bigger than any of the anti-war demonstrations, Mark. It's bigger than the civil rights demonstrations. It just happened right now. We saw that people stood up. And I think that these ICE raids are going to be so unpopular that I do think that Trump's going to move on to some other flashy object. And thank God for the people who have to work for a living and go out there, go to church and everything else. That I think
you mentioned church. Let me just quickly jump in, and I only have for a limited amount of time, and we can cover all this in our regular. In our regular forum on Thursday. I'm so grateful that you jumped in, but real quick, I'll just mention, I talked to you last night in the June Swoon event, which was a listener event that we got together about the religiosity that I thought was informing more and more of the law, and indeed today in the Supreme Court judgment on LGBTQ plus opt-outs, which allow parents to opt their children out of anything that includes LGBTQ plus references or characters in books, because if, and this is the religious part, if it goes against their religious beliefs. And so the Supreme Court ruled that legal, that those parents have to have that right to opt their kids out of anything that they feel goes against their religious beliefs when it comes to teachings in schools.
The symbol of our year may be the snowflake. Because this is so snowflakey, it's ridiculous, and it's anti-science, it's anti-history. How can you teach the history of the world, warts and all, when you have to keep pulling this kid and that cool out of, my father's a survivor of the Nazis. People should know about the Nazis. What could be more awful than hearing about the Nazis and their atrocities and how people suffered? That's got to be part of the curriculum. Slavery, my God, this was the original sin of the United States. We're going to keep that out of classrooms, or we're going to sugarcoat it. And likewise with this. Now, I think there's the thing about encouragement, and that's always been the bugaboo, that there's some kind of encouragement. You're going to have a lesbian teacher who's really encouraging lesbianism, fomenting this doctrine of hers, and showing you these sneaky books. But there's a record of what goes on, much more now than there used to be. Maybe it's not good, Mark, but people have their cell phones. They love to report on stuff. There's not like in my day that would have been something like really odd to, like, my teacher did this and did that in the other school. Your parent would say, "I hope you learned something." I hope you learned something like that. I think there's a huge receptivity to reporting on the supposed excesses in class. So I think all that stuff's going to come out. To me, this is just a talking point that these parents are so offended that their child is going to learn that some people, even the sex change, at some age, people should realize that there is some way that people can change their sex. Mark, it's so funny. It's like the drag thing. I mean, Shakespeare, right, had everybody changing roles, having.
No, you're right. There were no women in Shakespeare. I never thought of that. They were all men playing women roles.
Not watch Midsummer Night's Dream under this snowflake regime, Mark. It's just, of course, that's way too far. And you were right. You were wary about those decisions. And I did say that the majority that's on the Supreme Court now is likely to go that way. And they did something else terrible in one of the
well, they did something. I don't know how terrible this is, but the other thing was about pornography in Texas. You have to prove that you're 18 years old. And that idea is that people want to watch pornography anonymously. They don't want to, show you their driver's license, and that's what they require in not only Texas, I think other red states as well require this. Places where pornography and sexual material, erotic material has been ruled or is viewed in an immoral way.
Well, Mark, wasn't the biggest reason not to buy a condom when we were teenagers that the stupid druggist would yell out to all the other clerks, "Hey, some guy's up here in the front looking for a condom"?
No, that shame only goes so far, I guess. They want the law as well. Hey, David, thank you for joining us on short notice. Look forward to Thursday. Really appreciate you putting some perspective on this. And wow, it's a wild ride, and it's only getting wilder. So
I consider this my triple header, Mark, because my show is always on Thursday afternoon. Then last night's Jude Swoon, and today I think I tucked in within the 24 hours. So this was my triple header. And if your kid is born in America or they're not, mazel tov for having children, and mazel tov that your kid is born here, and they're going to have all the rights of a U.S. citizen because they are a U.S. citizen. And oh, by the way, there's a 100-year-old precedent that goes that way, and that this Supreme Court wouldn't follow that very clear precedent and just say affirmed.
Forever
Terrible.
the optimist, David Katz.
We're going to be fine, Mark. We're going to be fine, especially next Thursday. Mark, I have to do
now I want to get to a momentous decision from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has made a ruling, and to be clear, it's not a ruling on the constitutionality of an executive order pertaining to birthright citizenship. That was the thing that set this in motion. But as you're probably aware, it's more speaking to the vexing problem for Donald Trump of having his executive orders enjoined, stopped by judges nationwide. How can a judge in Seattle, Washington, rule my executive order, Donald Trump? How can that judge rule it unconstitutional or enjoin it in any way? How can this judge, who I don't even know, not a Supreme Court justice, stop anything that I want to do? So the power of that judge to do that, of any judge in America to do that, was challenged at the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Mark, it was the courts, the judges. It seemed like that was the last barrier in the way of complete and total authoritarianism, some would say.
Yeah, exactly. And so this really does enable the rise of what Kim is talking about. But I wanted to be clear that this isn't a SCOTUS ruling on the 14th Amendment. It's not a SCOTUS ruling on birthright citizenship. It is a ruling on this long understood manner in which judges can legally block some nationwide order, executive order, based on their interpretation of that constitutionality. Albert, if you would, here is some breakdown as we go through. I'll give you more. I'll also read you some stuff that I think is particularly good on this, legal analysis, and also societal, cultural analysis, and how this overlays that. But here is something of a breakdown from some legal minds this morning.
This was only about whether the district judge could enjoin the enforcement of that nationwide. What we'll now see is the actual question of what the 14th Amendment means, whether a president acting alone without Congress, without an amendment to the Constitution, can change our understanding of how we've implemented that for the last 150 years. That question will go back to the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett, in her majority opinion, making clear this decision has nothing to do with the merits of that legal question. The Supreme Court can prevent enforcement of that executive order nationwide. I expect we'll hear more about the merits of that question in the fall. As you read it, the real legal question is on what subject to the jurisdiction thereof means. Is someone who is in the country unlawfully subject to the laws of our country, like a diplomat would not be subject to the laws at the time of the 14th Amendment? Someone who belonged on tribal lands was not subject to our laws. So that's the question that the justices will now have to look at in the fall.
Sarah, thank you. I want to go back to Devin Dwyer. Devin,
I want to thank you. Yes, I think the key part there again is to underscore what I was just saying, that the judges will rule on the constitutionality of that executive order in the fall. So they've kind of kicked the can down the way. Meantime, there's true confusion as to what's happening. Here's more.
As if the court was going to stay these injunctions, how were they going to do it? Were they going to say that each injunction could only apply in the district where it was entered? And
Stop
two
for a
cases
second. I just
here,
want to be clear on what she's saying, and maybe you can go back a couple seconds. We can start it from where she was speaking. But when she says stay the injunctions, it's a little wonky, I think. And in other words, if the court was ruling that those injunctions couldn't stand, that those stoppages of the executive order couldn't stand, then she's saying it would proceed in a certain way. So staying the injunction, it's like stopping the stoppage, is what she's really saying. So go ahead. Although I think I made it more confusing.
If the court was going to stay these injunctions, how were they going to do it? Were they going to say that each injunction could only apply in the district where it was entered? In two cases here, those districts were actually statewide, the District of New Jersey, the District of Massachusetts. But the other question was, or could you limit it to just the plaintiffs in these particular cases? Remember that two of these three cases are brought by states. So how this changes that result, what does it mean then when the individual plaintiffs who have standing to sue are states? Does that mean that we're going to get sort of a patchwork result, as one of the attorneys general, Matt Platkin of New Jersey, described to me in an interview earlier this year? Does that mean that citizenship could be conferred solely by an accident of birth? And he described to me a situation where a citizen or a resident of his state gives birth over a state line in Pennsylvania, for example. What happens if a New Jersey resident gives birth in Pennsylvania? New Jersey is a plaintiff to these cases. Pennsylvania is not. If the child to two undocumented immigrants is born in Pennsylvania, what is the result with respect to that person's citizenship? These are a bunch of questions that are now going to result. But at the very least, we are going to see a circumstance where the president's executive order curtailing birthright citizenship is going to effectively be allowed to be implemented in certain states, but not in others.
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to get to. It's going to allow in the interim, and maybe beyond the interim, because it's going to apply in other executive orders, obviously, the power of the president to make it law in some states and not others, because in certain jurisdictions, the executive orders of the President of the United States will be enjoined. And based on this new SCOTUS ruling, those will have the power to stop whatever executive order Donald Trump is imposing. But elsewhere, where the executive order isn't challenged, the executive order will stand. So you'll have birthright citizenship in some states, in the case of this executive order that was on the griddle, and you'll have it not exist in others. And that's just birthright citizenship. I mean, you could have a real question as to whether or not somebody's a citizen. I was reading a legal breakdown this morning, and here's a situation. Let's say two immigrants have a baby in Montana, and no court in Montana has issued a stay against Trump's executive order. Does that baby have U.S. citizenship? I mean, I'd say no, because the executive order wasn't challenged in Montana, so it stands. So let's say Trump issues an executive order saying that registered Democrats cannot own firearms. And Democrats have to have their firearms confiscated. If a Massachusetts court issues a stay against this order, then a Democrat in Massachusetts will not have his gun taken from him. But if a court in, say, Idaho declines to issue a stay against it, then a blockage, then the policy can be put into place in Idaho up and until the Supreme Court finally rules on it.
Why would the Supreme Court do this and make things more confusing for everyone? Please
They're
explain.
trying to be cute. And I mean that in a, they're trying to be, to work around the edges first. And the edges involve, let's just discuss this judicial injunction thing first, so we don't have to discuss the executive order thing. We don't have to take on the president right away. And honestly, the Supreme Court is in the tank for Trump. They're going to try to get to allow him as much room legally as they possibly can. And you can see how they are setting up a vision of America that's very consistent with Donald Trump's, a red America and a blue America. An America where judges have enjoined executive decisions, have stopped executive decisions from going into effect, and in America, those red states where they're permitted. You know, again, separate but unequal, right? They are, this was the part of this legal breakdown. It suggested that the majority believes it's being clever, that's found a way to pretend to give Trump a win while delaying a substantive verdict on that executive order, as I was saying before. But they've set in motion a chaos for all the reasons that I was just pointing out.
Can I read Justice Sotomayor's dissent?
Yeah, this is a key. And so Justice Sotomayor, who's the ranking a minority justice, for her to read her dissent aloud is to underscore it. I mean, legally, it's of no greater import, but nonetheless, it's significant and relevant that she read it aloud. Go ahead, please.
No right is safe in the new legal regime the court creates. Today, the threat is to birthright citizenship. Tomorrow, a different administration may try to seize firearms from law-abiding citizens or prevent people of certain faiths from gathering to worship. The president, she said, has made a solemn mockery of our Constitution.
I mean, I think that really does say it. And I have to say, too, when the Supreme Court granted Trump broad criminal immunity, I think that really tipped the game, didn't it? I mean, didn't that tell you where this court was going to go?
Yeah.
And so you're seeing a legit undoing of the Constitution and the constitutional underpinnings of this country. Again, two Americas emerge from this. And a chaos is going to emerge from this. Cal Fireman says a row was the start of this. Yeah, maybe that's true too. Cheryl says that does say it exactly. It's a mockery. Yeah, it's scary. It's really scary.
Happy 4th of July almost. Woohoo!
Yeah,
Celebrate.
I know.
Party.
Where's your yeah?
Where's the Constitution? Where's the patriotism? Flush it down the toilet.
The Supreme Court will rule on rule on the constitutionality of the executive order ultimately, right? The Supreme Court will rule on whether or not it is legal to change this constitutional provision about birthright citizenship, but they didn't rule on that here. In the interim, there will be, as I say, a kind of emerging chaos about birthright citizenship. And also it opens the door for the rest of the chaos that I described and that Justice Sotomayor described as well. So it's a vision of America that is consistent with Donald Trump's, which is that there are two Americas. There are those who are with me, the red states, and there are those who are against me. You know, I think the months and years ahead will only fall cleanly into that vision of America and clearly be supported by the Supreme Court. And that's scary. So when, last thing, Katz, who I did reach out to, David Katz, I mean, on short notice with the Supreme Court decision being what it was and the timing of it, he couldn't join us, but I think you get the breakdown. It's pretty clean. He still could be right when he talks about the fact that the Supreme Court will likely rule that the executive order is unconstitutional, that it's just there in black and white in the Constitution, birthright citizenship. But as I say, this is significant because it extends well beyond birthright citizenship to other executive orders. Whatever the mad king can come up with may very well be in effect, state by state and jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.